Maybe I can get through it fairly quick, and maybe we can do some more questions, and we'll see. If not, I might not get the questions. But some of this we've kind of already covered, and some of it we haven't. I think the first thing you need to realize about swarm prevention is this is what you're really doing. They've got some instincts, and you can't change those instincts. What you can do, perhaps, is channel those instincts in the direction you want them to go, and that's about all you can do. There's a swarm up in a tree there. That one's from Wikipedia. How many of you have ever been in the middle of a swarm when it was tornado bees like that? Yeah. Wow. Life-changing, isn't it? The hair stands up on the back of your neck just remembering it. There's something magical and electrical about it. It's just mind-boggling. I've actually never gotten a picture of it myself because I was always busy scrambling around trying to get equipment to put the swarm in. So this one's from Wikipedia. This one is mine. It's a swarm I was trying to get to move into this hive, and they hadn't quite made up their mind yet. They're kind of still on the outside going, well, are we moving in or are we moving out? I don't know. I don't even remember what this one ended up doing. Sometimes they don't stay. That's some queen cells. We looked at those before. That's actually swarm cells. And one of the issues that I pointed out before, and I'll point it out again, is just don't assume they're swarming or not swarming based on where the cells are. Look at what the colony's doing. If the colony's rapidly building up and expanding and growing, and all of a sudden there's a bunch of queen cells, they're probably going to swarm. If they're kind of dwindling and sort of maintaining, then that's probably not swarm cells. The other thing to look at is swarm cells tend to be different ages. They don't tend to all be the same age. I think this one right here is still open. There's a bee actually trying to feed this queen. This one's capped. This one's capped. This one, that one might be capped. I don't know. That one's open. I think there's a bee with his head all the way in it there. So these are all different ages. Swarm cells aren't all the same age because what they want to do is they want to set up a scenario where they have the possibility of sending the old queen out with the first swarm and then send a virgin out with another swarm and a virgin out with another swarm and so on until they're done. And then they decide, okay, well, that's good enough. We're going to call it quits for this year, and now we're going to try and put a crop away. And so these aren't all the same age because they want this first one to emerge and leave before the next one emerges and then leaves. Which doesn't always work out that way. They end up confining her because this one's trying to get out and this one's already out but hasn't left yet. So it's actually interesting to watch. If you ever get I highly recommend getting an observation hive. And I highly recommend letting them swarm at least once. I wouldn't recommend letting them swarm all the time. It's kind of hard on them. But to watch the whole process once in great detail is just so much fun. You get to watch what they're doing. You get to watch this queen emerge. You get to see all of them leave, and then this queen emerges, and this queen's running around, and then these queens are piping. You can hear them piping, and they're all trapped because the bees won't let them out. There's a worker guarding each of those cells that won't let them out and keeps sealing the cap back up with propolis and then feeding that queen through the slit where they've kind of cut the thing open. But they won't let her out, so they're confining these, and then there's queens guarding those queens. There's bees guarding those queens from the other queen. The virgin that's running around wants to kill all of them. So every time that virgin starts to run up on one of these, they chase her off. You know, they manhandle her. They'll grab her, they'll ball her, whatever they have to do to get her away from those other queen cells until they're done. And they think they're done swarming, and then they'll let that queen go kill all the rest of them. Whenever they've finished all their after swarms. So another way to tell supersedure cells from swarm cells is by the fact that you have supersedure cells are usually all the same age. Swarm cells tend to be a range of ages. They don't tend to all be the same age. There may be 2 or 3 this age, and 2 or 3 this age, and 2 or 3 this age, but they're probably not all the same age.
Can you have several queens in a swarm?
Oh yeah, sometimes a swarm will have, sometimes in the chaos of that after swarm, several of those queens that they were trying to confine will get away because of just the mass confusion. You know, you've seen how crazy it looks outside the hive. It looks that crazy inside the hive too. They're just all running around like maniacs, you know. And so all of a sudden the one that was guarding this queen decides they're going to run off with the swarm, and then that queen gets out, and then this queen gets out, and then now there's 2 or 3 queens, and then they take off and end up with 3 or 4 queens in that swarm. Maybe 7 or 8. If it's a big hive, maybe 10 or 20. You never know. But yeah, you can end up with a bunch of queens in a swarm. It's not at all unusual. So let's just talk about swarming briefly. I tend to view this as several different things, and one of them would be an overcrowding swarm, and I kind of mentioned that before, I think, too. But basically, when we were talking about queen rearing, we talked about if they get overcrowded, sometimes they just want to raise a queen. Even though it may not be prime swarm season, it may not be that that was their plan. They got too crowded, they decide to swarm. So an overcrowding swarm is pretty easy to head off. You basically just keep enough supers on there and they usually don't swarm. In other words, if it's July and I keep enough supers on, they usually won't swarm. On the other hand, if it's May, I can throw all the supers on I want where I am and they may still swarm because they have a plan to swarm. They're trying to reproduce. So that's the causes of an overcrowding swarm. The causes of a reproductive swarm, though, I think are different. I think a reproductive swarm is basically something they've been planning on doing since last year. Last year they were trying to put enough stores away so that come spring they could build up enough to have enough extra bees to be able to cast a swarm before the main flow hits. So they were trying to build up enough last year to store away enough so that they could build up enough this late winter and early spring so that they could cast a swarm here and still have enough bees left to get their feet back on the ground to survive this winter. I think it's the goal of any successful hive is to try to reproduce. It's just what they do. It's like any species on the planet. They need to reproduce in order to still have bees. So I think that was their intent, was to stock up enough to be able to rear brood in late winter and then really get focused on raising bees. And then when it hits a peak, they make up their mind to do something. I don't know if you've ever paid that much attention, but again, with an observation hive, it's kind of fun to watch them because you'll see them make decisions. You'll see them change directions. You'll see them make up their mind. This is our goal. This is what we're working on. And then all of a sudden, everything shifts and it changes. In the spring, it goes from we're just going to bide our time and stay warm to we're going to raise a little patch of brood to we're going to raise a whole lot of brood to we're going to spend all of our resources raising brood to now we're going to swarm. And now we're focused on trying to put away a honey crop, and we're just going to work on bringing in honey. They've lost their interest in trying to raise a lot of brood. And that's kind of the sequence of events that's going on here, is to try to peak the population in time to swarm. Once there's enough bees and enough stores, they'll start backfilling the brood nest. There's this theory that there's a couple of theories that I think are wrong. One of them is that the queen decides where to lay. I don't think the queen decides where to lay. They decide where she lays by filling the cells or cleaning the cells. If they clean the cell and prepare it, the queen will lay in it. If they fill it with a little bit of nectar, the queen won't lay in it. If you watch them in an observation hive in your living room, you see this happen all the time. They'll restrict her down to next to nothing. And there's this very specific area you can see they've cleaned up and polished and prepared for her to lay in. And they'll expand it as they want to expand it. And if they decide they don't want it this big, they'll start shrinking it back down by filling it back in with nectar. And so it's not really the queen who's deciding this. The workers who are maintaining these cells are deciding that by whether or not they put nectar in them. So when they want to swarm, they start backfilling the brood nest with nectar so that the queen has nowhere to lay. Now there's also the concept that somehow they're going to slim the queen down by not feeding her. I don't think they have any choice about feeding her. If a queen asks a bee to feed her, they feed her. I don't think they have any choice about it. It's just their instinct. It's what they do. The reason she loses weight is because they're backfilling where she was laying and she's not laying as much. And when she's not laying as much, she doesn't eat as much food and she doesn't ask for it. When she doesn't ask for it, she starts slimming down and now she gets slim enough that she can fly. So she's getting slimmed down to fly by the fact that they're backfilling the brood nest and there's nowhere for her to lay. And then indirectly, she doesn't ask for as much food because she's not producing 2,000 eggs a day. She was producing way more than her weight in eggs a day before. Now she's down to just a few eggs a day. And so she's slimming down enough that she can fly with the swarm. So the other thing that happens as this is getting backfilled is that the nurse bees that are emerging don't have anything to do. It used to be they would have got recruited to be nurse bees. So it's a newly emerged bee. Normally you become a nurse bee, right? You go start nursing some larvae. There's no larvae to nurse, but they just backfill the brood nest. So they're basically unemployed. So they got nothing to do. So you got all these unemployed nurse bees. So about the time you get all these unemployed nurse bees and a queen that's all slimmed down, they'll build some queen cells. Queen will lay in them, and right around the time they get capped, the first one of those gets capped is usually when they'll swarm. So odds are, if you open up a hive and you find some capped queen cells, they already swarmed. That's most likely. It's possible they didn't. It could have been raining the last couple of days and maybe they haven't got around to it. Maybe that queen didn't get that motivated yet. I don't know. But all in all, I assume if I see them capped, they probably already swarmed. And I'm not going to risk leaving them queenless by getting rid of queen cells. So usually when they get capped, shortly after that they leave, and then sometimes if it rains a lot, that could actually last all the way up until they're about ready to emerge, if it rains for a week or two straight. But then the old queen, the unemployed nurse bees, and a bunch of field bees, there's an interesting mix of bees in a swarm. It's obvious that there's some field bees, and they actually seem to remember everything around here. I think every field bee that ever went out foraging stopped and investigated any place they saw that looked like it'd make a nice house. Because in my experience, I've got all kinds of hives sitting around, and there's always bees checking them out. And I think once they decide to swarm, I think those field bees remember that. I think they go along with the swarm for that purpose, because they know the territory. All those unemployed nurse bees, they've never even been out of the hive. They have no clue. They don't know where there's a good house to live in around here. But those field bees become the scout bees then for the swarm to start looking for the new house. They start going out and searching for a new house. And they may have already have a few in mind. I have seen a swarm that the second it congealed on the tree, it just took right off and left. You know, they already knew where they were going. They were just saying, okay, everybody up on the tree. Okay, everybody here, let's go. That's it. But sometimes they get up there on the tree, and now they start sending out scout bees, and they can't make up their mind what they're going to do. And they get stuck there for a day or two. Sometimes they get stuck there long enough that all those unemployed nurse bees who have their stomach full of honey because they filled up on it, they tanked up before they left, well, they're just the perfect age with wax glands to make a lot of wax, so they start secreting wax scales, and they don't know what else to do with them, so they start building comb, and then the queen says, oh, there's some comb. And she starts laying in it, and next thing you know, you got this outdoor colony hanging on a limb, and they're stuck, because now they got brood and they won't leave. And in my climate, they die. They never make it through the winter. I don't know how they do here, but they don't stand a chance at 20 below in Nebraska. And 60
I next spring, I got one of those in a box.
Yeah, I go places all the time where they actually survive, but they don't survive where I am. But they do happen. They'll get stuck and they don't know what to do. But so this is the typical scenario. Then if the hive's still overcrowded, a virgin leaves with the next swarm, and a virgin will leave with the next swarm, and that'll keep going until they decide that they're small enough. Right? So that's kind of the sequence. I'm going to mention this because there's a lot of people who've done this and have been very successful at it. And I don't know how to do it in my location, so I'm not going to talk much more about it other than to mention it. If you want to read Walt Wright's stuff, actually I'll point out I think almost all of this is available for free on Bee-Source now, because he basically made it available, so you can go read it for free or you can order it from him. Either one. But this concept of nectar management is basically, unlike my bees, his bees aren't in the top box coming out of winter. They're down in the deep box down here, and he takes this. He's running them in a deep with all the rest of them are shallows. A shallow underneath and several shallows on top. The shallow on the bottom is full of pollen. They're in the deep, and then he's got 2 or 3 shallows up here full of honey. So then he takes a shallow full of empty drawn comb and he mixes it in with this one that's full of honey, and he basically checkerboards it. So there's a honey, empty comb, honey, empty comb, honey, empty comb, honey, empty comb, and then the opposite on the next one. And what he's trying to do is create the illusion that when they get up to this honey, they think they're in trouble. They basically think they don't have enough stores. They look at that and they go, crap, there's a bunch of empty combs up here. I'm not sure we've got enough to build up and swarm. Maybe we need to stock some food away here first. And so hopefully you head off that instinct that says, well, we got enough food, we can afford to swarm. You make them think they can't afford to swarm. Basically, you just lied to them about their bank account. You just convinced them there's not enough in the bank account to afford this. I haven't had a lot of luck doing that in my location because my bees are already in the top. I don't have any honey to checkerboard. It's down below. Maybe I could. I just never had time to figure out how that would work. But here's what I usually do. I usually open up the brood nest. Basically, I like empty frames better than I like anything because I want to create this gap that then employs these nurse bees at draw and comb. So if I put an empty frame in the middle of the brood nest, it gives them a job. All these unemployed nurse bees now have a job drawing comb, and then as soon as they start drawing some comb, the queen starts laying in it. As soon as the queen starts laying in it, the unemployed nurse bees have a job taking care of the brood, and hopefully I can set things back. Now sometimes they're fairly determined. I may have to do this twice. Usually twice is enough. By then the main swarm season's over, and they're starting to think in terms of a flow, and they start putting away honey, and I'm past this. There's a variation on this. It's what Dee Lusby calls pyramiding up. It's really almost the same thing, except it's kind of with a different goal in mind. She's thinking in terms of trying to expand the brood nest up to the next box. I'm just thinking in terms of opening the brood nest. If I have to move some brood up to the next box to do that, which I may or may not, depending on what's on the outside edges might be honey. I might just move some honey up and just spread them out, which I'm perfectly happy with. She's trying to purposely get them to move into the next box. So she takes at least a couple of frames of brood out of this box and puts them in the next box. Puts some empty frames in here. Well, she'll put some draw and comb in there. But now the pyramiding up idea is that now that I've taken a couple out of this one and moved them up here, and I've got maybe one that's full down here, I kind of got one that's wall-to-wall brood here. I got a couple I took out of here, and I got the ones I took out of here up here, so it's sort of, spreading up this way to kind of get them to move up into the next box. And by expanding the brood nest, again, you create that situation where the queen has somewhere to lay now, and hopefully they'll head off swarming. Now, after you open up the brood nest, like I said, the unemployed nurse bees now have a job. Queen has somewhere to lay. Some more nurse bees get employed taking care of that brood. So the question is when to do this. Well, this is the hard part about beekeeping in general, isn't it? It's an art. It's not a science. I can't tell you on April the 27th you should do this because I don't know. I'd say likely I'd be doing this on May the 7th. If I was taking a wild guess, maybe May the 14th. But then some years it'd be the last day of May. Because some years everything's 2 weeks behind. Some years everything's 2 weeks ahead. So it's hard to say. But one of the things you want to keep in mind is you don't want to end up with chilled brood. So what you don't want to do is make a lot of gaps in a brood nest that isn't that strong. If you're going to put a lot of gaps in there, it should be a booming hive that's really got a lot of bees. So a good general rule is if I can make a gap to put this empty frame in and they can quickly fill it with festooning bees, I could probably put an empty frame in there and they'll probably do all right with it. If they can't fill that gap with festooning bees really quickly, then I probably shouldn't be making a gap in the brood nest. I should just leave them alone because they're probably having enough problems because I don't think they have enough bees to swarm, nor do they have enough bees to fill this gap in the brood nest. Does that make sense? So you got to play this by ear. It's also going to depend on things like how cold is it at night. If it's still getting chilly at night and they can't fill that gap really well, this is probably way too early. Because you don't want to end up with a bunch of chilled brood. They've got to keep all that brood warm. So you want to do this with care and be judicious. Now, once I see them building swarm cells, I figure they're hopelessly committed. I'm just going to do a split. I tend to call it splitting them before winds because I might do a minor split and they might still swarm. So I just take every frame that's got some queen cells on it and put it with a frame of honey and a nuke. I've got another frame with some queen cells on it and a frame of honey and put it in a nuke. And actually, if it's natural comb with no wires in it, I'll probably cut each of these cells out and put them with a frame of brood and a frame of honey and a nuke. I might even grab frames of brood and frames of honey from another hive if I run out of them in this hive because I've got so many queen cells. I'll just split them basically and make as many good queens out of this as I can. Now, to me, that's a bunch of good free queens because they're usually well-fed. The bees wouldn't be raising all these queens if it wasn't a prime time to be raising good queens and getting them well-fed and well-bred. So it's usually a great time to do those kind of splits. The only argument against that people seem to come up with is they'll argue that you're going to end up with swarmy bees if you keep doing that. Well, I guess it depends on your definition of swarmy bees. To me, bees that want to reproduce aren't swarmy bees, they're just bees. If the situation is the kind of situation that bees would want to swarm in, then that's not swarmy bees, that's just bees. Now, if it's this kind of situation that bees shouldn't be trying to swarm in because it's a really bad decision, then maybe I'm perpetuating swarmy bees. The other thing is, I would call those kind of bees that swarm and after swarm and after swarm and after swarm until there's no bees left. To me, that's swarmy bees. I don't really want those kind of bees. And once in a while, you see a hive like that. They just swarm themselves to death. They just keep swarming and swarming until they're gone. I probably don't want those queens. But just because they're trying to swarm, I don't consider that to be swarmy. This is a quote from P.C. Chadwick in the American Bee Journal in April of 1936. He says, "For years, our bee journals have been printing reams of articles on the question of non-swarming strain of bees. It's always seemed to me that there was a lot of time wasted advocating such an improbable accomplishment because nature would hardly yield to an arrangement that in itself might destroy the species. If accomplished, it would be tantamount to breeding the mating instinct out of domestic animals." I think it's a mistake not to see swarming as simply the natural reproductive method that the superorganism uses to reproduce. That's how they reproduce. If we manage to get them where they don't swarm, then we basically destroyed the species. I don't think that's the right direction. So I don't care if they have a reason to swarm and they're trying to swarm, that's not swarming bees, that's just bees doing what they do. So basically, like I said, I just take every frame that has a queen cell on it, put in its own nuke, and if I can cut them out, I might even do that. But if it's plastic frames, I just take the whole frame. If it's got 5 queen cells on it or 1 queen cell on it, I take it and put it in a nuke with a frame of honey. And you can make nukes, you can buy nukes of all different sizes. I like having a variety of sizes around it. It makes it easy to do splits. I don't know, as I move more and more towards 8-frame mediums, I may make more follower boards and do more, just put 2 frames in a follower board and some empty foundational frames in there, and maybe not make so many different kinds. But so let's talk about splits. One of the reasons to do a split we just mentioned, and that's that they're about to swarm and you just want to stop them. You can, if you wanted more hives and you're trying to keep them to swarm, you could have just keeping them from swarming. You might have just done a split with the intent that I don't really care if I get some honey. I just want some more hives anyway, and they're building up really fast and they look really strong, and I'm afraid they're going to swarm. You could do that. You could probably manage them better than that, but that's one of the things you could do. Sometimes you just want more hives. Sometimes you want to requeen, and by making a split, I make them raise a new queen, and now I can combine them back, and I've got a young queen because they raise a new queen. You can actually do a split to get more production. I know you think nobody would want less production, but I meet people all the time who do. They want less honey and they want a smaller hive. They're always saying, well, how can I make my hive stay really small? I say, well, how can you make your Great Dane puppy stay really small? I don't think you can. The fact is there's a biological process that the bees want to grow, and you can't really just make that stop. You know, you can split them to keep them small. You could spray them with some insecticide, I suppose. That would keep them small, but I don't recommend it. Probably your better bet is to just accept the fact that they're going to grow up. A little hive is going to grow up and then sell the split to somebody who wants some bees. And not think in those terms. But some people are doing this partly because they want to keep the hive small because they don't want to get too strong and they're kind of afraid of it when it gets too strong, or the neighbors are afraid of it, or whatever. Or they don't want to mess with all the honey. So they'll do a split and then a combine, and basically all of that just disrupts everything so much that it keeps them from getting quite so strong. To raise queens is another one. We talked about raising a few queens by basically making them, sort of doing a split. You take the queen out and put her in a nuke and then let them raise another queen. And then you use those queen cells. I think for doing a split depends on what you want for an outcome. If what you want to end up with is just more hives, you might make a different decision than if you want to end up with more hives and more production. And I'm not going to cover every possible variation because there's an infinite number of variations. I'm just going to throw some labels out there, and some of these labels are going to overlap each other, but they're just kind of referring to different aspects. For instance, well, I'll get to the names in a minute here. Well, let's talk about the concept of a split. When you do a split, both halves of the split, or both, or maybe 10 or 15, depending on how much you're splitting it, but all of the resulting colonies need to end up with either a queen or the resources to make a queen. Now, that means it could be a queen cell, it could just be some young eggs and larvae so they can raise a queen, it could be an actual queen in a cage, it could be a queen cell either that you raised or that you found in a hive that was about to swarm or whatever. But they need the means to come up with a queen, or they need a queen. And without that, they're not going to make it. So back to my 2 deep box problem before. If I got 2 deep boxes and I put this deep box over here and this deep box over here, and this one's nothing but honey, then they're not going to make it. They've got to have the means to raise a queen, right? So the next thing they're going to need is an adequate supply of honey and pollen. And this is especially important if you're doing a split and one of them's getting moved somewhere else. The one that's getting moved somewhere else will not have a field force for a while, because the field bees are all going to fly back to the old location. So if you don't give them enough honey and pollen to survive on, they won't have any bees to go out and get it. So in particular, you want to make sure they don't come up short on resources. They need resources to work with, honey and pollen in particular. You want to make sure they both get an adequate supply of bees. I won't say you always have to do something about drift, but you should always be taking it into account. In other words, you can't just move these bees all over there, leave these bees here, and expect the outcome to be that those bees are all going to stay there, because all those field bees are going to come back here. If you didn't take that into account in how you're planning on what you're doing, then you may leave those bees in trouble. Again, just like the supply of pollen and honey. If I'm moving those bees over there, I need to make sure they've got enough honey and pollen that they're not going to suffer when they don't have enough field bees if they all drift back to here. Now I can do other things to make up for drift. I could shake more bees into that one, and all the nurse bees will stay and all the field bees will come back. So they'll still be a little short, but at least have some more bees, and they can recruit them to go forage and maybe make up for it. But I'm not saying there's a fixed thing you have to do about drift, but that should be part of your plan. You should be taking that into account. You should be, when you're divvying up resources, you should be taking that into account. This new location isn't going to have the field bees to do what the old location could do. So keep that in mind. You need to respect the natural structure of the brood nest. The workers should all be together in the middle, and then the drone brood should be outside of that, and then the honey and the pollen should be outside of that. If you're just willy-nilly throwing frames around and there's some brood here and some brood here and some brood here and some brood here, well, they can't keep all that warm. It's all scattered all over. They need a consolidated brood nest, and they need... So look at the natural structure and try and keep it the same as it already is. The brood combs belong together. The drone brood ought to be on the outsides instead of on the insides. The pollen and the honey could either go outside that or above that or whatever, but it needs to be near the brood nest where they can get to it, not way off in some other box, 3 boxes away. You need to decide what your actual purpose is. What are you trying to accomplish? And if you want to try and maximize bees and honey, you can do that, but that's going to require taking into account timing and the distribution of resources. And we'll talk more about that later. What's that?
I got a question. When you do that split, the bees that get moved away from the original spot, would you want the queen in that location, or would you want the queen in where the original location's at?
Well, since we've established I'm too lazy to figure out where the queen is, I don't know. But if I knew where she was, if I happened to see her, I'd probably rather put her in the new location, the new location, because it's more likely to help keep more bees there, and they're not going to get set back as far, and they'll recover quicker. So if I knew where she was, I'd probably put her there. But I probably wouldn't bother to figure out where she was, because that's a time-consuming job. If I only had 2 hives, I might do that.
Where she was, then you want to put her in the other boxes away from the central location.
I would tend to. It's not that there's a right or wrong answer, but yeah, I would tend to, because they're at the disadvantage that they're losing their field force. They're at a bigger disadvantage, and giving them the queen might help make up some for the disadvantage I gave them. So, yeah. There's this concept that if I buy a queen, I'll be better off than if I let them raise their own queen. I'm not convinced that's necessarily true, first of all, because of the quality of the queen. We talked about that earlier, and the local bees and the local queens and all of that. But I don't think there's as much difference as people think. I bought many a queen that didn't start laying until 2 weeks after she was released, and she didn't get released until 7 days after I put her in there. And so now we're up to 3 weeks right there, and in 3 weeks, they just about could have raised a queen, and she might have started laying within 3 or 4 days. So you might have only bought a week at the most, maybe 5 days at the most. It may not be as much difference as you think there is in buying a queen and putting her in a cage and compared to letting them raise their own. But the advantages to raising your own we've already talked about. It's not like these are all different splits necessarily. These are just different concepts that are often used in a split. The concept of an even split is just that you evenly divided the resources. In other words, you didn't set up a little 5-frame nuke as a split and then a big strong hive. You actually pretty well evenly divided it. So it's not that any of these other splits could pretty much be an even split. This is just referring to that concept that we're going to evenly divide it into 2 colonies, and I'm hoping both of them will build up rather than I made one small weak colony that I'm hoping will catch up. So that's the basic idea. Now, if you set this up where the old hive was, I got to stand up, huh? Where the old hive, let's say the old hive was right here, and I set up the new hive facing this way, and I set up a new hive facing this way. I put a bottom board and a bottom board, and I divide all these resources up between these two. And when I get done, there's no hive in the old location. And all the returning bees come back to this old location, and they got to turn right or they got to turn left because there's nothing there. So they either go in the right hive or the left hive, and it tends to even them out quite a bit. So in other words, there's nobody flying back to the old location. Well, everybody's flying back to the old location, but there's nothing there. So everybody has to choose, and it's pretty equal distribution as to what you're going to choose because they're both facing the old location. This is an easy way to equalize the population and the drift. And then if you can even wait a few days and then swap them. I wouldn't wait more than 10 days. Because if you wait more than 10 days, you might have a newly emerged virgin queen who's starting to orient. And she hasn't flown out to mate yet. And now you swap places, and now she flies out to mate, comes back to the wrong hive, and then that doesn't work out so well. So I usually shoot for a week, because usually weekends, I work a full-time job, so weekends are when I'm getting stuff done. So if I did this on one Saturday, the next Saturday I'd swap locations and I'm done. But I wouldn't do it like a week and a half or 2 weeks later, because then I might confuse the poor queen who's trying to go out and mate and return to her new home. So a walk-away split. Now, a walk-away split could be an equal split, an even split. It could be a lot of other aspects. But the aspect that makes it a walk-away split is that you're not introducing a queen. You're just letting them raise one. You're splitting them, and they're going to raise a new queen. That's the whole walk-away concept. Yeah, it's just a variation on a walk-away. I don't know what a typical split is, but where I live, a typical split is somebody buys a bunch of queens, and then they do a bunch of splits, and then they introduce a queen to each of them. I don't necessarily recommend it, but that's just typically what they do where I am. That may be an even split, or they may split it up into a bunch of 5-frame nukes. But typically they buy a queen and they introduce her. A DeMarie is an interesting way to do a split. It's kind of like doing a pre-split. You put a double screen board between two boxes of brood, and the half that doesn't have a queen raises a new queen. And then the full DeMarie method involves playing with these entrances. You can kind of see an entrance there that you can toggle. There's like a toggled entrance in all 4 directions, and you play with those toggled entrances above and below in order to siphon the bees off. Once you know where the queen is, you siphon all the bees off to the one that doesn't have a queen. And the one that doesn't have a queen isn't going to swarm because they don't have a queen. And the one that does have the queen isn't going to swarm now because you siphoned all their bees off. I don't generally go to that much trouble, and the guy I know who swears that DeMaries are a wonderful thing to do doesn't do all that either. He does a very simplified version of it. Basically, he just puts that double screen board in between them. He doesn't even keep track of where the queen is. He comes back in 4 weeks and he looks to see where there's eggs and a queen. And if there's eggs and a queen in both halves, then if he wants to do a split, he just splits it. If there isn't eggs and queen in both halves, he just takes the board back out and lets them go. They usually raise a queen in the other half, and if something goes wrong and they don't succeed, that's fine. He just pulls the screen board out and lets them go. And it seems to work pretty well for him. He often ends up with a split. The split tends to get to share heat with the other half of the colony all the way up until they have a laying queen. So that tends to help them get a better start, get that queen raised before he splits them. So this is the complicated one, and probably the one that's an interesting. It's probably the most interesting concept. The idea of this is to get more honey and more bees. Everybody tells you if you do splits you'll get less honey, but this is how you can actually do splits and get more honey. I know it's a crazy concept, but let's talk about how it works. If you I'll skip this and explain it as I go. Basically, we're going to take a nice booming colony. We got this nice booming colony here. So we're going to put a bottom board down where we're going to start setting up a new one, and I'll probably put a bottom board down next door where I can put a box that I'm working on. I'll probably put an empty box next to it, and I'm going to start going, I'm going to pull all the supers off for the moment if there are any, and just get them out of the way. And then when I get down to where the brood is, I'm going to start sorting the brood into, I'd probably put another bottom board in a box over here. So I'm going to sort the brood out into these 2 boxes, because I'm going to put all of the open brood over here, and I'm going to put all the cat brood over here. Now, I say that, and it sounds very distinct, and like there's a specific difference between a frame of cat brood and a frame of open brood. But there really isn't. There's a frame that's mostly cat brood and one that's mostly open brood, and some that are just an even split. So I can't really do that, but I can kind of do that. I can put everything that's mostly capped over here and mostly open over here. So I take all the mostly open brood, and I've got it over. So if I had like 2 deeps, I now have 2 deeps with most of the open brood and most of the capped brood, right? Everybody follow that so far? Okay, so now, hopefully I found the queen in the process. If I didn't, I don't know. I may not bother to look for her again, but I'd like to find her. I really would. And since I had to go through all the brood to sort it, I probably did find her because I had to go through every frame, and I'm pretty good at spotting queens. So probably I spotted her, and I'm going to put her with the open brood. So I got the open brood over here and the old queen, right? So I'm going to take the open brood and the old queen and any honey I find, I'll put in another box, but I'm going to take all the honey, all the pollen, the old queen, and all the open brood, and I'm going to put it over there somewhere in a new hive. Everybody follow that? Okay. So what's at the old hive? All the cat brood and all the field bees who are going to return back to here. So what happens is, if I do this 2 weeks before the flow, all of this cat brood and emerging brood in the next 2 weeks is going to emerge. So I have this huge population of bees that just emerged, and they have no job, which is kind of similar to the whole swarming scenario, right? Except they can't swarm. Why? Because they don't have a queen. There's no queen. They can't swarm. So I have this huge population of bees that's emerging that gets recruited to go forage because there's nothing else to do. Other than there's a few queen, they're going to raise a few queen cells because, like I said, I can't get it perfect. So I will try and make sure somewhere in here there's some eggs and some open brood, but odds are there are. It'd be difficult for me to avoid it just because some of those cat brood are going to have some open brood on them. There's probably some eggs and some open brood in here. So now they're going to raise a new queen. While they're busy raising a new queen, they're recruiting all these young bees who are emerging to forage. So they've got a huge foraging force and no bees to feed, no brood to take care of. You know, they've got no other job but to focus on hauling in a crop because there's nothing else to do except for the few nurse bees who are taking care of that queen, the new queen cell. Now that hive over there lost its entire field force, but I made up for it. I gave them all the honey and all the pollen. So they can survive long enough to get that batch of bees there in the middle of raising done because they have all the honey and all the pollen. And by the time they get done doing that, they'll start recruiting a field force, and then they'll have a field force after that. And they won't make a crop this year, but they'll build up enough to get through the winter. Odds are. If not, I may have to, you know, if if we get an early drought, I may have to feed them a little bit, but odds are they'll probably do fine on their own without me having to do anything. So they won't swarm because they don't have a field force. And these guys won't swarm because they don't have a queen. And so I can crowd these guys up, and this is a typical way that comb honey is done, is you crowd them up into the supers. If you want to do like Ross rounds or hog half combs or any kind of cassette basswood sections or anything like that, you've got to crowd them up in there to get them to build a bunch of comb really fast. And you got to have a lot of foraging going on and a lot of comb building going on to end up with that nice soft white comb really fast. So that's a cut down split. And the reason it's called a cut down is I took this brood nest that was this big and I crowded it down to this big. And now all of these bees pretty much are coming back to here except for the few nurse bees that were on that. And because all the field bees came back here, and now all these bees are emerging, and so they get crowded up into the supers and they start working in the supers. And that's the cut down part is that I removed half of the brood nest and put it over there. Now if this was 3 or 4 boxes, I might crowd them all the way down to 1 in this one, maybe. Depends on how much capped brood it is. Pretty much this is going to be all capped brood. If I've only got 1 box of capped brood, that's fine. I'll put all the open brood over there, however many boxes that ends up being. But I want to crowd them. And I don't want any open brood over here to speak of. There's going to be some, there's no way around it, but I mostly want a lot of emerging bees that are going to get recruited. That's the idea. It's early recruitment of those foragers. So ideally you want to do this about 2 weeks before the flow. Because if you do this 2 weeks before the flow, even those ones that just got capped will emerge right when the flow hits. And the ones that got capped a little earlier will emerge a little before the flow hits. But basically when the flow hits, all of them will have emerged and there's really no brood to take care of. And that's just an ideal situation to recruit a whole bunch of foragers. And that's why it makes a crop. If you miss that and you land right at the beginning of the flow, they'll still probably do pretty well if your flow lasts 6 weeks or so. They'll probably produce more honey. If it lasts 8 weeks or 12 weeks, they'll probably produce a lot more honey. But if it's a real short flow, that 2 weeks before the flow is probably your best bet. You know, that's always your best bet if you can get it. If you get 3 weeks before the flow, it's not going to be the end of the world. But that 2 weeks is the ideal. That's the ideal time. That's what you're shooting for. And of course, from year to year, the flow tends to move. But you ought to map it out and figure out when the main flow hits in your area and ask around. And when you've got that kind of pinpointed, when it happens in a normal year, you can shoot for that. And then if you're off a little bit because one year is different than another, it'll work out pretty well. So, I've been through all that. Well, I'll do a, I'm not going to do that one, but let's do, this one. If you want to set a world record, here's a good way to do it. Get your 2 booming colonies sitting next to each other and do the same thing except do both of them. Sort all the open brood out, and you can make that into 2 splits if you want, or you can make it into 1, it doesn't matter. But mainly you want to get all the open brood out of here. And you want to get all the capped brood to 1 hive that's going to sit right in the middle. So you're going to combine these 2 hives in the middle. Where these two were, we're going to put it right in the middle between them. They were up against each other, so now there's only 1 hive when they all come back home, and that's the only place to go. And this is all of the capped brood, and all of the open brood got put in some splits. Probably 2. I'll probably take 1 box of open brood and the old queen from this one, and 1 box of open brood and the old queen from this one, and put them off to make my splits. And now this is all crowded together into 1 hive, and all of those field bees from both of those hives come back here. And I've got a hive that I'll be stacking supers on with a step ladder, and probably, maybe I could set the Guinness Book of World Records. But I'm not sure if you want to. It's a bit of work, and it's kind of a scary hive. If you've never had a hive that strong, and it is a little intimidating. There's a lot of bees. But it's a fun game to play. So that's pretty much the splits and swarm control. We got questions? Wow, I answered all your questions. That's amazing.
Well, if we have time, since you're not going to be here in the spring, could you just talk a little bit about spring management?
Sure.
Before we go on to that, I was wondering, you were talking about just putting bees together from two different hives. How do you keep them from killing each other?
Well, odds are if I do what I was just describing, there'll be so much chaos they won't know what's going on, but I can always blow a lot of smoke around. Smoke is your friend. It creates a lot of confusion. Basically, these guys are all coming back to what they think is their hive. And the bees that are on the brood, I can pretty much just mix them up, and they tend to just accept it. And if they look like they're fighting, I'll just pour a whole bunch of smoke in there until they're more worried about the smoke than they are about fighting. And then I keep going like that, and eventually they pretty much settle down.
When you combine, when you do a split like that and you have all the workers going to one hive, do you ever have trouble with lane workers then because there is no queen?
The cause of laying workers is a lack of open brood, and it usually takes about 3 weeks of no open brood to develop some laying workers, or more, but 3 weeks is probably about right. What usually happens, and that's probably about 5 weeks of being queenless, if that was the cause. Because if I made them queenless today, it's going to be a little while before there's no open brood, and then once there's no open brood, then they start developing ovaries, and then that's like 3 weeks of that before I really have a serious problem with laying workers. So in the meantime, it's just going to be a typical walk-away split. They're queenless, they have a little bit of open brood, and they're going to raise a new queen. So I don't usually have a problem. Laying workers is a whole other topic. We can talk about that briefly if you'd like. If you ever get a hive that's if you ever want to head off laying workers, you just give a frame of open brood to the hive, and you'll set them back for another 2 or 3 weeks. If you've got a hive that's already laying workers, and you give them a frame of open brood every week for 3 weeks, they'll start raising a queen. And that'll almost always set it straight, but that's convenient when it's in your backyard. It's not so convenient if it's a 60-mile-away out yard, but a 60-mile-away out yard, I just shake them all out on the ground and give the equipment to somebody else and call it good because it's too many trips. If it's in my backyard, I'll give them a frame of brood every week for 3 weeks, and they'll raise a queen. But, you know, my backyard, it's easy enough to go out there and do that. So, but it's the pheromones from the open brood that keep them from developing ovaries.
At what point do you give the workers a queen again, or open brood? How many weeks do you?
Well, I'd expect to see a queen in this hive. If I did this cut-down split today, they'll have a queen that has emerged but isn't laying yet in 2 weeks. They'll have a queen that is laying probably in 4 weeks. I could give them a frame of brood anytime in there if it makes me nervous. But and it isn't going to hurt anything, and it's going to help make sure they don't develop laying workers. So a frame of open brood is never going to be a bad idea if I'm in doubt. But odds are it's not going to be a problem. They're just going to raise a new queen. So,
But all the brood is capped. There won't be any eggs.
no, there'll be some in there. There's always some in there. Like I said before, if I pick up a frame of this hive I'm trying to sort out into capped and open, it's not going to be all capped. It's going to be 80% capped and 10% open brood. It's never going to be 100%. It's a nice idea. I'd like it to be 100%. I think that'd be great. And I could put one frame with some open brood in there and have a little more control. But it doesn't matter. It's not going to be so. It's the way. But there will be some open brood in there because they're not all one or the other.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so we want to talk about spring management. I think you need to realize what it costs them to raise a frame of brood. It takes a frame of honey and a frame of pollen and a frame's worth of water that they got to go gather and bring back. You ever see how busy they are in the spring when they're raising brood? Man, they're hauling a lot of water. And it's not that hot out, so they're not just cooling the hive with that. Like every other creature on the planet, bees need water. So they'll haul a lot of water. It takes a lot of water to raise a frame of brood. And then it takes the effort of a frame's worth of nurse bees who have to generate enough heat to do that. So they got to have the honey to generate that heat. Depending on how cold it is, that could be more or less. So it's costing them a lot to raise a bunch of brood in the spring. And you may have watched them go through the winter, and you're checking them in February and March, and it seems like they haven't eaten much of anything. What happened to my projector?
Turn itself off. I think we're out of time.
Spread your tongue.
I don't know what the deal is. Maybe it'll turn back on, or maybe it overheated, like you said. I don't know. But first thing in the spring, you do need to keep in mind that they can easily starve. You'd think they haven't eaten hardly anything all winter, because they haven't. It's amazing how little amount of honey they can go through in the winter and stay warm. But the problem is, come spring, they start trying to build up way before anything's even blooming, and then they start going through stores in a hurry, because they're burning up a frame of brood and a frame of pollen just to raise this one frame of bees to try and get started raising brood. Now they're raising 4 or 5 frames of brood, and that's another 4 or 5 frames of honey and 4 or 5 frames of pollen that they're going to burn up to raise this brood. So suddenly they're going through stores like it's nothing. I mean, they're going through, a lot of stores very quickly, and that's the prime time when they could easily starve. I wonder what this deal is here. So I'd keep an eye on them early in the spring. I want to make sure they don't starve to death. That's a time that they often starve to death. When to feed them in the spring, some of this is going to be locality dependent, If the hive's light and I'm afraid they're going to starve, I'm going to feed them. If the hive's heavy with stores, I'm not going to feed them. But it may be in some locations, feeding them might stimulate them to raise more brood. Doolittle was quite fond of his millions in the bank plan. His millions in the bank plan was this: if a colony comes into spring with lots of stores, they'll spend them. If a hive comes into the spring with not many stores, they won't spend them. So if they come into spring with lots of stores, they'll raise a lot of brood. They'll spend that honey and they'll raise a lot of brood. If they come into spring without much, they won't. So if you have a hive that's coming into spring without much, you may have to feed them to stimulate them to raise some brood. But if they got plenty of stores, they'll raise a lot of brood, and they'll raise it more based on a decision they made on what's the best to do under the circumstances, rather than on you fooled them into thinking the circumstances were different than they really were. You fooled them into thinking it was later in the spring than it really is, and they raised a bunch of brood, and then they get caught in a cold spell, and then you get some chilled brood, or you get some other problems. Now that may not be as big a problem here. We can get a really hard freeze in March or April, and it could really get them stuck on brood, and they could starve to death because they can't move off the brood because it's so cold. I'm not sure it gets that cold in spring here, ever. But I always get a bang out of people who are in Florida, and they write me, should I wrap my bees? And I'm like, where do you live in Florida? I don't think there's anywhere in Florida you need to wrap your bees. No, I don't think so. You guys don't even know what winter is. I don't know why you're worried about winter. Here's a quote from C.C. Miller. When's the best time to feed the bees? The best is to never feed them. Let them gather their own stores, but it's better to feed them than let the bees starve. That tends to be my philosophy. I think the best time to feed bees is to not feed them. But if they're going to starve, then by all means, feed them. We talked about switching boxes already, so I'll skip that part. I do think, though, on the switching boxes issue, if switching boxes is going to break up the brood nest, I wouldn't do it, because I don't think it's a good idea to be breaking up the brood nest early in the spring. I think it's a bad idea.
But how are you going to know until we broke it in?
No, I'm talking about
Just do
you rearrange the brood nest by doing this. It's not so much that you opened up and took a look in there, but I tend to leave them alone in the spring for the most part. I'd recommend this. Every time you go to a hive and you plan on opening it up, look at everything. Look at the traffic. Look at the time of year. Take everything into account, and then take your best guess on what you think is going on in this hive before you open it up. And if you go through that mental process before you open it up, and now you open it up, and it's not what you thought it was going to be, you can make adjustments. And after a while, you'll get where you can look at it and come to a reasonable conclusion about what's going on in this hive. And what you'll find is a lot of those hives, you can just leave them alone. They're doing fine. You look at them, there's lots of traffic, they're doing fine. Leave them alone. it looks like they're not doing very well, there's not that many bees, they're definitely way behind everybody else, well, then you might open it up and take a look, see what's going on. Maybe they're queenless, maybe they're running out of food, maybe there's something else going on. But I would try to get to the point where you don't need to open them up very often. These are things that will stimulate them to raise brood. Pollen or pollen substitute will stimulate them to raise brood. Syrup will stimulate them to raise brood if there's no nectar available. If there's nectar available, it really isn't going to make that much difference. But if there's not, it might stimulate them to raise brood. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing depends on your location, perhaps, because if I fool them into thinking it's later in the spring than it is, and then they get caught making a bad decision because I fooled them into thinking it was later than it is, I may not have helped them. So yeah, the problem where I am is the chilled brood, getting stuck on brood and starving, and sometimes it's just that the timing should be that they should hit their peak of population right at the main flow and then bring in a nice big honey crop. If they hit the peak of population 3 weeks before the flow, then they're probably going to swarm. They're probably not going to make me a honey crop because I just fooled them into building up at the wrong time and they missed the flow because they were 3 weeks early. They're looking to peak this population out at just the right time to make a crop, and I just fooled them into doing the wrong thing. If you live in an area where they're always building up on the flow instead of before the flow, then you might come out ahead by fooling them into raising brood sooner. I don't know. I don't think that happens where I am. I don't think I ever come out ahead on it. I say this just because I haven't tried this in every location, so I can't say how it works out in every location. But if they build up too late, then you end up with a whole bunch of bees after the flow's over instead of before the flow. And that's not really what you want. So the goal is basically to build up and then peak the population right at the flow. These are famous beekeepers too. I've got quotes of all of these on my website on what they've said about feeding to stimulate them to raise brood in the spring, and all of them were against it. They found it to be totally unproductive. Here's just one from W.Z. Hutchinson. This is a really good book, Advanced Bee Culture. He basically says the feeding of bees for stimulating brood rearing in early spring is now looked upon by many as of doubtful value, especially this true in the northern states where the weeks of warm weather are often followed by freeze-up. The average beekeeper in the average locality will find it more satisfactory to feed liberally in the fall, enough at least so that there shall be sufficient stores until harvest. If the hives are well protected and the bees well supplied with an abundance of sealed stores, natural brood rearing will proceed with sufficient rapidity early in the spring without any artificial stimulus. Now see, this is my view, is if I give them enough stores they can raise brood, they have the facilities to do it. This is also Doolittle's view. I don't have to stimulate them to do something else that might be the wrong thing at the wrong time. I can let them do what they would normally do, which is probably the right thing at the right time. Now, I keep caveating this with I don't live where you live, so I don't know how it works out here. I do know how it works out in Nebraska, and that's how I feel about it there. And I think this is just a quote from Hutchinson on locality, and I think it's a good statement. He says, I used to be, in my earlier beekeeping years, I was often sorely puzzled at the diametrically opposite views often expressed by different correspondents for the bee journals. I think that's one of the things that confuses new beekeepers a lot. There's so many contradictory things out there, but part of the reason for some of those is the simple fact that people are in different locations, and things are different in different locations, and it works out different. Another thing is, I think there's a lot of times that people will write about something they've done in beekeeping, and they don't put it in the context of exactly when and under what circumstances they did that. And it turns out you do it under different circumstances, and it turns out a disaster. And so you say, well, I'm never doing that again, when actually it turns out it might be a great idea under the right circumstances, but it's not a great idea under the wrong circumstances. I also, the third thing that plays into this diametrically opposed views is that there are often people who look at the exact same evidence and come to totally opposite conclusions. You know, a dog says to himself, they feed me, they take care of me, they love me, I must be a god. No, he says they must be a god, right? And the cat says, you know, they feed me, they take care of me, they love me, I must be a god. Well, they're both looking at the same evidence and coming to opposite conclusions. One of them depends on your point of view. What is the pessimist believes we live in the best of all possible worlds, and an optimist believes we live in the best of all possible worlds, and the pessimist is afraid he's right. But you can easily come to opposite conclusions just because of your view of things, and the way you see it. But some of it is just locality. The fact is, it's going to turn out differently in a different place because it is different. The whole situation is different. So I think you want to find out how it works in your locale. You also want to keep in mind, though, that not every year is the same. Some years, everything's going to be running 2 weeks late. Some things, everything's going to be running 2 weeks early. And you just have to accept that. It's weather. It's the way it is. In the 80s, we were going through an ice age. The world was going to come to an end. We were all going to get caught up in an ice age, and we were all going to freeze to death. It was 40 below every night for 2 months where I lived in Mitchell, Nebraska in 1984. Every night for 2 months, it was 40 below. I've been rooting for global warming ever since. I know. So sometimes you just get a late freeze, sometimes you just get an early spring, sometimes you get a late spring. You don't know how this. So even once you figured out kind of what to do, another year will throw you for a loop because the weather just turns out different, and you've got to try and figure out, well, what do I do now? Because this isn't what I expected. It's all 2 weeks early, or it's all 2 weeks late, or it's all. But that's why beekeeping is an art and not a science, right?
In your experience, do bees kind of predict that, or do they get caught by surprise as much as?
Oh, they get caught by surprise, no doubt. Do they have a sense for some of it? I think they have a better sense for it than we do, yeah. But are they always right? No, they're not always right. Sometimes they're totally wrong, and sometimes it gets them killed. That's part of the reason probably why a lot of swarms don't make it. They make a bad decision on when to swarm, and then they make some bad decisions on whether to raise brood or whether to just stock away some food. Everything's a trade-off, and they got to make all these decisions, and they make them, and sometimes they're not the best decision, and sometimes they are. I think they make better decisions than we do, trying to fool them into other decisions, but they don't always make the right decision. If you do need to feed them in the spring, for instance, when they're running out of food, keep in mind they really can't take cold syrup. If you give them syrup and it's 30 degrees at night and it's 60 degrees during the day, it's never going to get warm enough for them to take it. That's just reality. So you might want to put some dry sugar on there, put a candy board on there, put something on there that they can eat if they're starving. That doesn't require them to warm it up. The other thing you can do, if you have to feed them, is you can warm the syrup up and feed it to them warm. That's kind of a pain. It means you kind of have to go out to the hive every morning, dump all the syrup in a pan, take it back and warm it up, take it back out and put it back on the hive. But it's worth doing if a hive's going to starve and if it's in your backyard and you don't have to drive 60 miles to get there and you've got the time to do it. You can do that, and they can take warm syrup. They can't take 50-degree syrup. Now, how hot can you get it? If you can put your finger in it and not burn yourself, it's probably not too hot. If you put your finger in it and you're going to get burned if you leave your finger in there, then it's probably too hot. You probably shouldn't give it to them that hot, because they may take it and they may injure themselves, and you don't want them to do that. I never feed anything but 5 to 3. I feed 5 to 3 because it keeps well. It's a little more diluted than 2 to 1, but I can't get 2 to 1 to dissolve very well, and it crystallizes too fast. Yeah.
Okay, so when you say 5 to 3, does that mean 5 cups of sugar and 3 cups of water?
You can do it by weight. You can do it by volume. You can do it any way you feel like. A pint of sugar weighs about a pound. A pint of water weighs about a pound. If you want to do it by pints, if you want to do it by pounds, I tend to mix them up because it's easy to measure water by pints, and the sugar comes with pounds already marked on it. So I tend to put 20 pounds of sugar, and so 5 to 3 would be about 20 pounds of sugar and 12 pounds of water, 12 pints of water. A pint's a pound the world around. A pint of sugar, a pint of water, a pound of sugar, a pound of water, a pound of sugar, a pint of water, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
They're interchangeable, pints and pounds.
That did me.
I didn't know that. Well, it's not interchangeable on everything. It just happens to work out for close enough for government work for sugar and water. It doesn't work out for honey. A pint of honey weighs 1.5 pounds, yeah. A pint of honey weighs 1.5 pounds. It doesn't weigh a pound.
So if I wanted just to make a little bit, I could just 5 cups of sugar and 3 cups of
Yes,
water.
that would work just fine, yeah. That would work just fine, yes.
Warm it up a little bit.
I would either, I tend to boil the water and then add the sugar just because it tends to keep longer if I boil the water, and it tends to be easy to dissolve. So I just boil the water first, turn the heat off, add the sugar, and stir it till it's all dissolved, and I've got well dissolved sugar, and it tends to kill anything that was living in the water because I boiled it, so it's keeps really well. I'm not sure. I may change my view on this because I haven't fed since they started putting neonics on beet seeds, and they started going to GMO sugar beets. Back in the last 40 years, I've always bought beet sugar because it's always cheaper. And not only that, I lived in western Nebraska where they were growing them, and you know, it's the politically correct thing to do when your neighbors are growing sugar beets. But now that they're putting all this other stuff on it, I'm not so sure. I'm iffy on that. I may stick with cane, but then they'll come out. They're already talking about coming out with some GMO cane, and I'm not looking forward to that. So we'll see. And I would much prefer to support anybody who's not doing GMO and not using neonics, even if I didn't think it made a difference to the bees. So I don't know, but as far as the bees are concerned, it really doesn't matter that it's from beets or cane, but it might matter that they're putting neonics on the seeds, and now that they're doing GMO beets, I don't know. I think the only thing they're splicing into the GMO beets is probably that Bt toxin, and that's probably not going to hurt the bees any, but I'd rather not support a GMO industry, so I think it's a bad idea in general. So even though I don't think that's specifically going to hurt the bees, just because Bt toxin is something bees have been exposed to that didn't seem to be a problem. But anyway, so we got pollen substitute. I don't see much reason to feed much pollen in the spring where I am, because by the time they're raising a lot of brood, there's real pollen available, because the maples start blooming in March usually, and they're not hardly even flying by the time they start blooming, and they keep blooming pretty much while they're flying up until something else is blooming. So it just seems totally unnecessary. If I feed them pollen, they pretty much ignore it anyway because they'd rather have fresh pollen. So, and I don't see much point in short-lived bees from artificial pollen, which we talked about before. So a lot of managing bees is managing room. It's managing space. If you give bees too much space and they can't guard it all, then you have problems with ants and wax moths and small hive beetles and whatever other pests want to move in, because they have to guard all this space. So there's no point giving them more space than they need, but on the other hand, you don't want them to run out of space. So part of your job in the spring is managing space. When do you add some supers? Because if you wait too long, they'll swarm on you. If you put them on too early, they may have trouble keeping the brood nest warm, plus they may have ants and whatever else trying to move into all this excess space that they now have to take care of and guard. So keep in mind that you kind of want to manage this. If you've got 2 boxes, they're absolutely packed wall to wall with bees, you could probably add 2 more boxes, and they can probably manage that. But you don't want to add more than that yet, because they probably can't manage it. In other words, you could probably double the space they have if they've pretty much occupied the space they have. But you don't want to put much more than that on, or you're probably going to stretch them too thin. Does that make sense? That's a general rule of thumb I'm giving you, but and there's probably more art to it than science again. Once the weather's really warm and the main flow's coming on, you can probably get away with piling a lot of boxes on there because it's not cold at night anymore. So the chilled brood isn't so much of an issue, and the population is just exploding. So, you know, adding a little more space probably won't be a problem once they reach a certain critical mass, and the temperatures are warm. So generally, you can double their space if they're about out of space. It's the 80-20 rule, is basically that if they got 8 drawn frames in this box, I could probably add another box, right? When they got 8 drawn frames in this box and they filled up the bottom box, I could probably add 2 boxes. When they filled up all of these pretty much, I could probably add 4 boxes. So I could probably double their space without stressing them out, but I probably shouldn't put more than that on, or I will stress them out. So there's the whole supering thing in the spring. Do I top super them or under super them or nadir them? I don't think the bees really care. They just want room. Give them some room, they'll fill it up. I'm all for, if you're doing foundationless and it's your second box, you just put a package in this box. I think putting the next box underneath is a real good plan, because early in the spring, it tends to still be kind of cold, and they tend to keep drawing it down, and they do pretty well. And if you put it on top, sometimes they'll start building up from the bottom bar just because it's so far up to this next top bar to start working their way down again. So, but once you're up and the weather's warm and you're up a few more boxes, it's not so much of a problem. But I always try to put a drawn comb in the middle of a foundationless box for a ladder for them to get up to the top to start working back down. But other than that, I don't think it's that big a deal. The idea of undersupering as opposed to nadering is you put it all the way on the bottom of everything. Okay, everybody understand that? It's a term that it's been around before, but it really didn't come into the beekeeping world until the Warray stuff. But the Warray people are big on in nadering. They're going to put it all the way on the bottom. It works fine on the bottom. The concept that bees only work up is kind of absurd, because if you think about it, they move into a hollow tree. Where do they start? At the top. And where do they work? To the bottom. So to say that bees only naturally work up doesn't make any logical sense. Obviously, bees start at the top and work down in the tree. Now, if I throw the boxes on the top, they naturally work up because that's where the space is. But so top supering and undersupering, well, undersupering might be a great idea from the point of view of maximizing the amount of honey you get. I don't know, but it also maximizes the amount of heavy boxes I have to lift. And I'm not into maximizing the heavy boxes I lift, so I put them on top. Because I don't notice enough difference to be worth that extra effort. That's my opinion. I just throw them on top. But those are your options. Some people are very big on, you have to add this empty box under here. Well, how are you going to know when this box is full? You're going to lift all these heavy boxes off so you can look at this box to see if it's full. Well, yeah, that's way more work than I want to do. So, some people requeen every spring. I think any queens you get really early are going to be really poor queens, because that's just the nature of the beast. You raise queens really early, there aren't enough drones, there's not enough food, they're raising them at not the optimum time. And yet where I live, that's where most beekeepers buy their queens. They buy them early in the spring so they can do all these splits and or requeen them all early in the spring. I think they'd be way better off to buy queens in the summer or the fall from those same queen breeders if you wanted to buy them from them, because then there's enough drones flying, they might actually get a decent queen. Probably not, because they're probably buying them from California or Georgia, and they aren't very well adapted to Nebraska, but at least they'd be raised at a time when there was a chance of getting a good queen. Spring is the least chance of getting a good queen. If you wanted to buy a queen from me and I was keeping up enough to have any queens available, I wouldn't have any before June. The end of June would be the earliest I'd have any queens, because it's too early for me to raise them before that. I can't get good queens before that. There's no point in me trying. I want to go with the flow of what the bees are doing and get good queens, and I can't do that. I can't get you a good queen in May. It's not going to happen. I might be able to get you a good queen in June, but chances are those will be sold out, and you'll probably have to settle for July or August, right? So, if a queen's failing, then you probably do need a new queen, but maybe your best bet is just to let them raise their own. We've kind of been through some of that. There is the issue of replacing losses. I don't recommend packages anymore. I used to recommend packages a lot just because it seems like a lot of the stuff I'm recommending, you're going to want bees on different combs than they're available on. You're going to want them on either natural or small cell, and you're going to want them on mediums, or you're going to want them in a top bar, and where are you going to buy a nuke to do that? Well, that's a problem, but the problem is the packages are so crappy anymore, I don't see the point. You may as well just throw your money away and do something else. You might find a beekeeper, a local beekeeper, who'd do a shake and swarm for you. If you get him to give you a queen and shake a bunch of bees in a box, you take it home and put it in your top bar hive, that's probably your best bet to get started, especially if you get some local stock. So you can get some local stock and a little shake and swarm in the spring, they'd have a lot better chance than the package. That's my experience. The advantage, of course, to the package is I can put them on whatever kind of frames and foundation I want. The advantage to the nukes, I'm kind of stuck with whatever they're offering. There are people out there offering medium nukes, but there aren't a lot of them. There's a lot more demand than there is supply. So if you want to raise nukes, I'd recommend you raise them on mediums. I think you have a pretty good demand. The other problem is that this varies a lot. You know, if somebody says they're selling nukes, a nuke isn't just a nuke. Is this a local nuke that was overwintered? Is this just a bunch of bees off the almonds that they split up into 5-frame boxes and threw some queens in? What is the source of this nuke? Where did it come from? Because there's nukes that are nothing but a package they dumped in a box with a queen. So basically, you're just buying a package that happens to be on some frames, but it's not really a nuke. It's not like it was a colony that overwintered and sees itself as a colony. It's just a package. So you want to keep that in mind. You might look around. You may find some local beekeeper who just sell you a hive. You might expect to pay a little for that because that's a lot more than just a package or a nuke, but it's probably worth it, especially if it's local stock. So ideally, I'd like to see a local overwintered nuke. That's what I'd like. That would be the ideal. And the rest of those are what we already talked about. Feral bees are a great source of bees. The problem is it's not a reliable source of bees in the sense that if you want fish for supper tonight, you might want to go to the grocery store. If you like fishing, fishing's a lot of fun. You might catch some fish and they'll probably be pretty tasty. It's the same kind of thing. You can go fishing for swarms. You might catch some swarms. You might not catch some swarms. It's fun to catch swarms. I'd go catch some. But meanwhile, I might make another plan if I'm really intent on getting some bees this spring. That's a more reliable plan because just like fishing, bait hives, if you hit a good spot, man, you can actually catch one swarm after another, after another, after another. And if you hit a bad spot, you don't catch any. So you don't know what you're going to catch. It's an iffy proposition, but it's certainly worth doing. It's worth trying to catch some feral bees. You can also get on some local swarm lists. Cutouts are kind of whole other matter. A cutout, basically, you're getting into somebody's house, and cutting all the combs out and rubber banding them into frames. And if you're a new beekeeper, that may be more of an undertaking than you want, although that's exactly how I got started. I was too poor to buy any packages, so I was doing cutouts, but I'll tell you what, I had no idea what I was doing, and I got stung. Man, I had no idea what I was doing. But I learned a lot, and I lived through it. That's the important thing, right? So I don't know that I can recommend it, but I can tell you that's what I did, and I can't complain about the outcome. But it was a bit tough until I finally bought a bee suit of invulnerability from Walter T. Kelly, which was a full coveralls with put gloves on and put some rubber bands on your wrists and your ankles and zip it up in a zip-on veil, and sooner or later a bee will get in, but it won't be very many, you know? It's way better than just working with a veil. You may have some local swarm lists around here. You may be able to get a hold of some of the exterminators and get them to put you on a swarm list. I don't know, sometimes different areas seem to be different. Sometimes just the bee club keeps it, and then the fire department calls the bee club, and the bee club calls the first person on the list, and if they can't make it, they work their way down the list. But if you can get on a swarm list, that's one good way to get a bee. Capturing swarms, I'd highly recommend it if it's not more than about 8 feet off the ground. The last time I was trying to get one 20 feet out of a tree from a ladder, I shook a whole swarm down the back of my neck. And they tell you swarms won't sting, but they lie. And that's when you realize that I have to stay calm while I climb back down this ladder, because no matter how much they sting me, my hospital bill isn't going to be worth falling off this ladder. I need to, and you also start contemplating, well, even if it's $100 for a package and half of them die, it might still be cheaper than my hospital bill. So I'd recommend, actually I've got other ways I deal with them high up now. I don't climb ladders for them anymore. It's not worth it. Just keep in mind when you're getting bees, what it's worth. The amount of time you're investing and whatever, when you can go buy bees from somebody else. So sometimes it's worth the effort, and sometimes it's more effort and danger than it's worth. So don't get yourself hurt. It's just not worth it. It's not worth going to the hospital over. You could buy a hive of bees from somebody for a couple of $100, maybe $300 or $400, but certainly less than your hospital bill. Prime swarm season would determine the timing on when would be a good time to put out bait hives or to try and do any of these things.
How would you get them from high in the tree if you didn't do a ladder?
Well, I've got a couple of things I have done. One of them is I made a bucket. Take a 5-gallon bucket and some EMT pipe and some fittings, and you can mount the EMT electromechanical tubing, which is another word for conduit. But you put EMT pipe on the bottom of this bucket, and you have it mounted in the middle of it, and then you run a rope up through the middle and make a harness that goes 3 ways to a lid, and then so the lid's hanging off this way, and when you pull on the rope, it pulls the lid on, right? Okay, so now you can add pipes as you need depending on how tall it is. You get straight under it and put on a jacket with a veil so they don't fall down the back of your neck, and you slam it straight up under the swarm, and they fall in the bucket. And then you pull on the rope, and it closes the bucket, and then you bring it down and you put it in the hive. But I've even stopped doing that most of the time. Most of the time I take 3 old boxes that have had bees in them before and a couple old brood combs and some queen juice. I keep throwing old queens in a jar of alcohol, dip a Q-tip in the queen juice, and dip the other end of the Q-tip in some lemongrass oil and put it in the hive and put the lid on it right at the base from where the swarm is, and I come back that evening and take them home. And they almost always move in. They don't. If they already have a place picked, I can't sway them. But if they haven't picked a place yet, they pretty much can't resist that one. And I really think that the real tipping, I mean, all of that adds up. But the lemongrass and the queen juice are just more than they can handle, because that's the 2 things that they organize on that have them here in the first place. And now they smell that there. So already some of the bees are thinking, is the cluster down there or is the cluster up here? So they're already going down there. Now some scout bees are checking it out and coming back and saying, man, there's a really nice home. And it's right down there, you know. And so pretty soon more of them are moving down there, and then pretty soon they're all moving down there, and then pretty soon they're all moved in. I come back after dark to pick them up and take them home.
Really?
It's not 100%, but it's pretty good percentage. And I don't have to climb a ladder. Yeah.
Question, and then there.
Yeah, is this on? It is. So for us people who have top bar hives, do you have any practical words of wisdom on ways to apply the knowledge that is in the material that we read?
Bees are bees no matter what kind of box they live in. I'm kind of baffled that there's all these people who think that there's some kind of magical box that will make bees more than what they already are. Bees are perfectly happy living in old gas cans and abandoned water tanks and abandoned cars that have the gas tanks all dried up. You'd be surprised how often bees will move in there. I've seen lots of those. I've seen lots of them in 30-gallon barrels and you name it. Bees can thrive in almost any old box. They're quite adaptable.
You said it before, bees don't care.
Yeah, they don't care. That's a
You
fact.
have to care.
Yeah.
They don't care.
It might matter to you what box they're in. Because it's going to change how you're going to manage them and how well you're going to be able to manage them. But the bees really don't care. So, but most of the management isn't going to be that different. Now, there are some specific things like, obviously if I put newspaper on top of a bunch of top bars that don't have gaps on them, I'm not going to get the same effect when I put the sugar on there. So, but other things like swarm control, if I put empty bars in there, I'm going to have the same effect of getting them to expand the brood nest and avoiding the swarm. And so a lot of these things are the same. They're just bees. You're managing them as bees, and that's how that works out. Some of the things that are different in a horizontal hive of any kind, not just the top bar hive, but any horizontal hive, maybe I should point that out. When you're trying to decide what kind of hive you want, guys, there's a lot of things you can get that you may not realize you can get. If you don't want to lift any boxes ever, you can have a horizontal hive, and you won't ever have to lift any boxes at all if you don't want to. Although you might find a little box handy to put 3 or 4 combs in so you can harvest them and haul them back to the house without the bees getting all over them again. But you don't really have to have big, heavy boxes you have to lift if you go with a horizontal hive. And you can do a horizontal hive that's a top bar hive, or you can do a horizontal hive that's actually a Langstroth hive. You can put deep frames in it, you can put medium frames in it, you can put whatever in it. It's not that hard to build if you can find anybody with any reasonable amount of carpentry skills. It's not that complicated of a box to build. It's just exactly the same as a 10-frame Langstroth hive, except you make it 4 feet long instead. And then put your frames in it. And then depth, you want to add 3/4 to it to make the little gap that the bottom board would have made. And then put a piece of plywood on the bottom, and you've got yourself a long hive. Got a piece of plywood at the top. So you can avoid lifting boxes by going horizontal. And one of those options for horizontal is a top bar hive. The big advantage to the top bar hive for me is you can build it out of scrap wood really easily. It doesn't require a lot of cabinetry skills. I built them with nothing but a skill saw on several occasions, and easier with a table saw, but I've done it with nothing but a skill saw. I suppose I could do it with a handsaw, although I never actually had the determination to do that because it would take me a while to rip all the bars. But so that's one of your options, is to go horizontally. Now the issues of managing a hive horizontally are that the space is kind of fixed unless you want to add some supers. And you were trying to avoid lifting boxes. That was the whole reason to go horizontal, so I don't want to add supers. So if I go horizontal, I have to kind of change some of my management. One of the things is you find that they don't want to expand so far sideways, because what happens is they start expanding sideways, but then they decide to put a comb of honey in, and that tends to make a wall that the queen doesn't want to go past. So now to get them to keep expanding the brood nest, I may have to put some empty bars in here to get the brood nest to expand. Otherwise, I can't get them to expand out and fill this whole box. They just want to kind of leave the brood nest here and maybe put some honey over here, and then the population doesn't keep increasing because the brood nest is kind of shrinking. So that may require a little different management on a horizontal hive than a vertical hive, in the sense that I may have to work harder at expanding the brood nest, and it may require more frequent interventions. In other words, it doesn't require more work. I don't have to lift 10 heavy boxes off to get down to the brood nest, or 5 or 3 or whatever. So in that sense, it's actually less labor, but on the other hand, I may have to do it more frequently. I may have to get into it more frequently if I want to manage the space well, because the space is fixed. I can't just pile boxes on to change the amount of space. I have to manage the space, so I might have to harvest. I don't want to harvest too aggressively, or it may end up that I've taken too much honey and there's not enough of a year left for them to build it back up to get through the winter. So I'm probably going to have to harvest more often. I'm probably going to have to put things in the brood nest more often. I'm probably going to have to manage them. Do I have to manage them that intently? No, I can just ignore them and they'll probably just swarm, and it won't be the end of the world. But I probably won't make any honey doing that. If I want to manage them and get anything out of it, I probably want to manage them more carefully. But most of this applies, but you just may have to, you have to adjust to the fact that, well, sometimes there's no gap between the top bars, so that changes the whole sugar thing. Sometimes there's the fact that it's horizontal means I may have to manage the space a little differently. I can't just throw some boxes on, so on and so forth. But other than that, you can raise queens, and you can take this top bar hive, make it queenless. They'll raise a bunch of queen cells. You can take those queen cells and put them in top bar nukes or other top bars and raise queens the same as you do in anything else. So, yeah.
Raising queens, you mentioned the best availability for best made queens is June and July.
Well, I'm talking about for me to raise them, yeah.
Similar here.
Yeah, probably.
Swarm season starts end of April here and beginning of May. So how do I reconcile the virgin queens getting mated from the prime swarm versus having lots of drones available later in summer?
I'm not sure I followed the question. Try that again. I'm getting
So,
tired. It's the end of the day here.
Prime swarms come out a lot earlier than I see a lot of drones flying.
Oh.
Does that create a problem for the mother hive when the virgin queens come out and there's no one there?
Well, they never swarm without a lot of drone comb in the hive. In fact, that's another fact when we were talking about how do you tell the difference between a supersedure cell and a swarm cell. One of the ways you can tell is that there'll be a lot of drone comb in a hive that's swarming. And that drone comb is probably on the verge of emerging when that prime swarm got cast, if some of it hasn't already emerged. It's going to emerge very shortly, and it'll probably be timed to end up with plenty of drones out there about the time that those queens do need to be mated. So some people who are trying to push it earlier will to raise queens earlier. We'll look at it from the point of view of when did they cap these drones, and when are these drones going to be sexually mature, and I can start raising a queen anytime early enough that those will be sexually mature when these queens are going to be flying to mate. And that may be what the bees are doing, but to me that's more complicated than I've been able to pinpoint very well. I don't have a lot of luck, it seems, until there are some drones flying. When I see drones flying, I can usually get them to raise queens, and before that I don't usually have a lot of luck no matter how tight I'm trying to cut it. But maybe the bees can cut it tighter than I can and make it come out right. Certainly there are some queen breeders who believe that. They believe that as long as I've got drones that are capped on this day, and they're going to be flying on the day that I think this queen's going to be mating, and things are good. That's probably how the bees are doing it.
Thanks.
That makes sense.
Well, you don't have to run. My quick question is, can you bring the swarms down by lights or noise? I've heard something along those lines.
I have no idea. I was always too busy getting all my other equipment together. I don't know. Yeah, that seems to be a controversial one that's always around. I've always wondered who has time to do that. Aren't you busy getting your boxes to put them in? Aren't you busy getting your... I mean, I'm busy doing other things, and the fact is they always are gonna... they're gonna land somewhere. I mean, I don't know. It's hard to say if I caused it or not. I wouldn't know. If it works, I'll speculate on why it might work, if it works, which I don't know. If you could make it, and again, it'd be difficult to prove it scientifically unless you actually went at it from the point of view of a theory on why it might work. If why it works is because they think it's thunder and they think they need to settle, then you're going to have to make a vibration that they're going to sense as being thunder, and that's probably going to be a very low vibration. Bees basically can't hear. Bees are deaf, but they can feel vibration. They're very sensitive to feeling vibration, as a matter of fact. Now that sounds like a contradiction in terms, but it's really not. I mean, if I put my hand on this table and I can kind of feel it shaking, that's just sensing vibration. That's not hearing. Hearing is a whole different thing. Hearing is a very complex, specific interpretation of the vibrations that are coming through the air that's being interpreted as these vibrations that are coming through the air. Sensing a vibration that thunder's crashing in the sky is a whole different thing from hearing. And bees can't hear. They don't have any ears, but they can sense vibration pretty well. So maybe if you could convince them that it was thunder, maybe that might work. I don't know. I've never tried it. The light one, somebody's told me, has worked for them to get them to come down. They get a mirror and get light on them and get them to move down. My guess is, if anything, maybe it's irritating them and that's why they're moving. I don't know. I have no idea if that would work. I've never tried that. I was always too busy just trying to knock them out of the tree, but I don't know. Maybe I should.
Experiment.
I do think, I do think you can lure them down with queen juice and lemongrass oil, and old comb helps, and an old box helps, and can I lure them down with something else? I don't know. I've heard of people putting a frame of open brood on a stick and sticking it up there by the swarm and getting the swarm to move onto the frame of brood and then bringing it down, and that seems like it might work, but I've never tried it. It seems like I've never... Swarms, I don't know. Maybe I should be better prepared for a swarm, but usually I'm just running around trying to get what I need to get the job done. I never have time to try and figure out if banging on pans will get them to land or not. I don't know. Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
You've mentioned observation hives a few times.
Sure.
How large is your observation hive? I know on your website you have pictures of one. Is the one that you have actually?
The one that's usually in my living room, I actually have several. You know how that is, you accumulate things over time. The one that's in my living room most of the time is from Draper Super Bee. There's actually there's one somewhere in the Northeast, but there's one in Auburn, Nebraska. Apparently the two guys are brothers. And the one I bought is from the guy in Auburn, Nebraska. But this is looking at my observation hive in my living room. I reworked it. It was 2 deeps and 2 mediums, 1 frame thick when I bought it. I wanted all 2 shallows and 2 deeps. That's what it was. I reworked it. The way it's set up is it's got a 1-by with notches in it for the frames on the sides that's screwed in. And so I unscrewed this 1-by. It's like a 1-by, about a 1-by-2, and I cut new notches in it to change the spacing so that it would be a medium and a 3/8 gap, and a medium and a 3/8 gap, and a medium and a 3/8 gap. So I got 4 mediums, and then I made a feeder. I think I've got the... You can kind of see the feeder at the top there. I made it with a piece of glass and a piece of glass, real glass, not plexiglass, but real glass that I built the frame, and then it's siliconed onto the frame, and then it's got the top bar on it just has an oval hole in the middle of it with screen wire to make a ladder that goes down in the middle, so they don't have access to the whole feeder, but they can crawl down right in the middle. And I might have a close-up of it here somewhere. Maybe. I think I do, I don't know. It's been a while since there's a feeder. There's a close-up of the feeder. You can see the screen wire ladder there in the middle. And you need some kind of feeder.
When you work on them, I take it you take them outside or?
Yeah, I take it outside. I think I talk about it here. I take 3 pieces of cloth and I put one over the outlet on the hive and put a hair tie on it, you know, like rubber band. Yeah, put one of those on there and then another piece of cloth and a rubber band here, and then I run around outside and put one on the outside, because otherwise all the returning field bees will pile up behind this one on the inside. And then when you go to open it up and hook it back up, you got like 500 bees trying to get out, and that's not very conducive to what I'm trying to do. So I run around on the outside, put one on the outside, and then they tend to start piling up out there, and that's fine. So then I haul it outside and do whatever it is I'm going to do. Then it depends on how much work I want to do. If I just want to do a little bit of work and then take it back in, I'll take it a good 20, 30 yards from the door, and then when I'm all done, I'll brush it all off, and pick it up and run about 10 yards and set it down and brush them all off, and pick it up and run about another 10 yards and brush them all off, and then I can usually take it in the house, and I've gotten rid of most of them. But they keep following me, you know, so you got to keep trying to get them all off. And then I might have 1 or 2 still on it when I get in the house, but usually that's all of them. And then I hook the tube up the same way I undid it. And the last thing I undid was the one on the outside to let them all back in. And I've never had more than 1 or 2 bees get loose in the house. And I tried to rig up some fancy valve, whatever kind of thing. I never came up with anything I was that happy with. The one I bought from Brushy Mountain does have kind of a slot and a piece of plexiglass that just drops down in it that blocks it. And that seems like a good idea. I don't know, but it seems like a good idea, and I've used it, and it works all right. But as far, I didn't build it, it was already built that way. As far as building it, I'm not sure of a good way to build one when I don't have that. The Draper one has a Lazy Susan on it, so you can spin it around, which I love. I don't know if I got a picture that shows the Lazy Susan on the bottom or not. Guess I don't see it. And that's what I use for a curtain. It's just a piece of black cloth. I just cut the fit and doubled it over, and it kind of blocks the light so they don't get all exposed to too much light. I've got some holes drilled. You can kind of see them at the top there. I've got one over to one side of where the frame is so it won't land in the food. That's number 7 hardware cloth over it so that I can drop pollen in there in the winter if I need to give them a little pollen to give them a little boost. If I get them to raise a little bit of brood in the winter, I may get them through the winter with enough young bees to come out of the spring. And then in the middle, I've got number 8 hardware cloth. I can pour honey or syrup down into that frame feeder. And I usually just feed them. If it's winter, I usually feed them honey because I don't have a problem with them getting robbed in the winter because there's really no other bees out. If it's a dearth in the summer, I usually feed them syrup because they're too prone to getting robbed, and I don't want to give them. I don't want odor in there that's going to attract the robbers. But anyway, it has a. I can't get to the. This is the tube going out. Basically, it's a 1x4 under the sash of the inside window and another 1x4 under the sash of the outside window, and a hole through both of those 1x4s so that the tube goes through the 2 1x4s to the outside. And then it's got weather stripping on the 1x4 so it seals up on the where it sits on it. And then there's duct tape on the inside of the tube and the outside of the tube so you can't pull the tube through the hole because I've got grandkids and somebody's sooner or later going to grab it and pull it inside if I don't do something to prevent that from happening. So it's got some duct tape on the outside to make it fat enough it won't fit back through the hole. So if one of the kids grabs it, pulls on it, it won't come in. So that's how it's connected to the outside. So it's free flying all the time. 365 days a year they can fly unless I close them up for some reason to work on them. If I need to work on them for a longer period of time, what I'll do is I'll set up some empty boxes out there to get a nuke up to the same level basically where the tube was. And I'll put a little nuke there and put all of them in the nuke, block the tube so they can't get in, and it's 2 inches from where the entrance used to be to where the nuke is, and then I might actually rework the whole hive and spend a couple of days on it when I'm done I'll put them all back in the hive, open this back up, they come back to where the nuke was, it's not there, but the opening's there, they can smell the hive, they all fly back in. So if I need to do some longer term work, some more major rework, I've never had an observation hive, I didn't end up reworking it somewhat, because it seems like there's all these little things that get in your way, like you pick it up and the frames shift, and now it's up against the wall, and they're getting squished, and you're like, well, that won't work. So you end up getting in there and putting little screws or brass screws or thumbtacks or something to hold this thing in the middle so it can't shift around, and drilling holes so I can put some pollen in, and drilling holes so there's not quite enough ventilation, so I put another hole in there for some ventilation and stuff like that. So it seems like I'm always reworking it from time to time, but it's just tweaking it to try and make it work better. I could probably get by without most of those things, but you really need to be able to feed it if you want to get it through the winter. Because they can take feed all winter because it's 70 degrees in my house, so they can take feed all winter, and if they need it, I can feed them. And I think I need to be able. Observation hives are kind of boom and bust. They boom and all of a sudden they're swarming, and they bust because they all swarmed out. And so a lot of times you have to boost them with a little bit of bees, or you have to cut them back because they're going to swarm on you if you don't, or whatever. You get to observe a lot of problems in one. You know, it's real easy for them to end up queenless and turn into laying workers, and then you get to watch that happen. You get to watch the laying workers lay. You get to see all sorts of things you don't get to see in a hive because you're not there to watch them. You get to watch the whole sequence of events of them becoming laying workers. I used to wonder about a lot of the things I saw in a hive, and I didn't know what I was seeing. But when you see a hive where there's some queen cells, and there's a few scattered larvae here and there, but they're not even, none of them are adjacent to each other, and maybe there's an egg somewhere, but hardly any eggs. And you look at that and you go, well, what's going on here? Well, what's going on here is they're starting to develop some laying workers. And they know it. They're trying to raise a queen from some of those eggs from those laying workers because they don't have anything better to raise them from. And at this point in time, you could probably introduce a queen, they'd probably accept her because they're trying to raise a queen. You could also give them a frame of brood, and they would raise a queen from the brood you give them right now at this point in time. But if you wait another week, there'll be a bunch of 3 or 4 eggs in some of those cells, and they've torn down those queen cells because that wasn't going to work, never was going to work, and they kind of knew it, but they were desperate. And now you give them some brood to raise a queen cell, and they're not sure what to do because they're sort of iffy. And then if you wait another week, it's pretty much guaranteed they won't start a queen cell unless you give them some open brood for about 3 weeks, and then you can get them to do it. So you get to watch that kind of stuff in an observation hive. You get to watch that whole sequence happen, and you start to become more aware of the stuff you were observing that didn't make sense, you know, in a hive because you're just seeing a snapshot. Well, now you're not seeing a snapshot. Now you get to sit down and watch BTV for 2 hours every night when you get home from work. And it's the best channel on television. It really is. And you don't even have to pay the cable company to get it. Yeah, it's untethered. But and no commercials. So yeah, I highly recommend an observation hive. I think every beginner ought to get an observation hive. You will probably kill it, and in the process of killing it, you will learn so much more than you will from killing a full-size hive, and you'll kill a lot less bees, right? So that's always the argument against having an observation hive for a beginner is, well, you know, it takes a lot of skill to run an observation hive. Well, that's true. But actually, you know, the cool thing about an observation hive is you make this little adjustment and you see a big difference. With a big hive, you make a little adjustment, you don't notice much difference at all. For one thing, you're not there to watch the details of what happened from your adjustment. Where in an observation hive, you make that adjustment, you get to actually see the details. You get to actually see what they did. You know, now that you've created this situation, you get to see what they did. Whether you gave them more food, or you gave them some pollen, or you gave them whatever, you get to watch what they did and see how it affected them. If you can stimulate them to raise some brood in the middle of winter by giving them some pollen and some syrup, or how much it did, or whatever. You get to watch all that. I just think I learned more, I think, in a year of an observation hive than I did in 10 years of keeping bees in hives, because you just get to see everything. You know, you get to see them bring the pollen in. You get to see them packing it in the cell. You know, you don't get to. How many of you have ever seen a bee pack pollen in the cell? See, you don't see that when you just open up a hive, though. But you see that in an observation hive. You might see it in a hive if you look for it enough and you open enough hives, but It's just not what, it's just, you see this stuff that you just wouldn't see otherwise. When you open up a hive, pretty much they're all looking up going, what the heck is going on? They're not going about their business. A few of them are, but for the most part, they're still trying to figure this out. In an observation hive, they're just going about their business. And you get to watch them going about their business. That's just so educational, I think.
What side of the house would you put an observation in?
That's a good question, I suppose. Mine's on the west side. I suppose I got a big tree there, so it's pretty much in the shade all day, except I've got cedar trees all across that side, and so it's pretty much in the shade until late in the afternoon, and it's usually not that hot then. And I've got the curtain on it, and I've got a blind on the window as well, so usually there's no sun on it. You don't want it where there's sun on it, or you get a solar wax melter, which is a bad thing. It's an observation hive. So you definitely don't want the sun on it, and you don't. But I don't think it matters that much, really, as long as you don't let them end up in full sun where they're getting too hot. I think they'll do pretty well about it anywhere. Especially if you've got air conditioning, which I don't. If you have air conditioning, you've got a pretty even temperature all the time. Me, I've never lived in a house with air conditioning, so they're getting pretty hot in the summer, but generally the houses I've lived in don't, even if it's 100 degrees out, usually don't get much over 80 or 90 in the house, because usually I've got enough trees around to keep it in the shade, and so it usually doesn't get that hot. Now I live in a house with 2-foot thick brick walls, and it takes it a long time to heat up. So it tends to cool off at night and stay pretty decent. But if you've got air conditioning, heck, they're going to be 70 degrees all the time. They ought to be able to manage that, even with a little heat from the window.
An observation hive for every living room.
Oh, yeah.
Your new addition.
Absolutely. It's funny how many people are like, oh, I don't think I can handle that. What, are you serious? This is my grandkids love it. They'll sit and watch it for hours, you know. And they learn to find queens. They learn to spot the queen. Oh, there she is. There she is. There she is. All the time. They can just walk right up and spot her.
How many times a year do you have to clean the glass part, the view part of wax?
I'd say about once a year I take it out and totally go over everything. It seems like it. You don't necessarily ever have to, but some of it depends too on what you got. What I've got here is a, I don't know where my pictures are. What I've got here is actually, what do you call it, safety glass. This is safety glass. This is back when it had too much space. I actually changed the bee space now. It had about 2 1/4 inches between the glass, and it really should be about 1 7/8 inches. 1 7/8 to 1 3/4, somewhere in there is a really good space. 1 inch and anything less than that's a little too little, and anything more than that, they'll start doing this, where they build some burr on the glass. Well, this one was about 2 1/4, I think, and they're building burr on the glass. The upside is, though, if you look, you can see some of that has honey in it, some of it has pollen in it, and occasionally they would lay some brood in there. And then you actually get to watch it develop, and that's almost worth having a 2 1/2 inch gap. But eventually they keep building more and more burr, and it's harder and harder to see what you're doing, so I got tired of it. But the glass is easy to clean. You can just scrape it off with a scraper, and then you can spray it down with some Windex and wash it and wait till it airs out good. The plexiglass, I've got several that are plexiglass. It's easier if you're building your own to get plexiglass. But I wouldn't recommend just plain glass, because the problem is a little kid will walk up there with a toy and go wham and break it all to smithereens. So I've seen my kids hit this one, and or my grandkids, and they've never broken anything. I'd be afraid if it wasn't safety glass. So the rest of mine are all that I've built have all been plexiglass. It's easy to get plexiglass and cut it. It's easy to get regular glass and cut it too, but it breaks too easy. So the plexiglass is a little trickier to clean. You got to get a rubber spatula, like a Rubbermaid spatula, and kind of scrape off the main stuff. And then I soak it down with food grade mineral oil. If you go buy mineral oil laxative, it has no odor to it. And unlike baby oil, which has odor to it, you don't want that. But you get mineral oil laxative, it has no odor to it. It's just mineral oil, and you put that on there, and it'll soak that wax up, and you can wipe it down really good, and then you can come back and use some Windex on it and wipe it down really good, and then you can let it air out good, and you've got it pretty clean. Of course, eventually it'll get scratched, and it won't last forever, but it's cheap enough and easy enough to cut another one. But if I was making one, you want an inch and, I've got details on my website on kind of the dimensions, but you want an inch and 3/4 or so between the glass. But if I was making one, I would tend to probably cut that out of a 2x, so I got a little bit of room to work, cut my notches in for the frames to sit in, and then you can buy these shoes that they used to put mirrors on walls. They're little plastic things, the screw goes in here and it comes out and kind of makes a thing sort of like this where the mirror sits behind here and the screw goes in here. If you put that on that plexiglass, you can put that plexiglass on the front of that frame and have it, when you want to open it, you just take like 6 of those screws loose and pull that off. You don't have to get into all the hinges and all the other cabinet work. You just got basically a 2x frame that you've ripped the 2x down to 1 3/4 and you put this frame together and then maybe cut a 2x12 maybe at an angle, corner to corner, to make a little angled brace at the bottom so it doesn't do this. Put them on the outside down here in a big base that's probably just a 2x12 for some weight so it doesn't tip over, and then screw all that together. So you got a 2x12 on the bottom, you got a frame with the angled things there screwed in here and here to keep this from flopping around. You've got a 1 1/4 by 1 3/4 frame coming up and across here, and then make it come out right for the size frame you want. I use the size frame you're using in your brood nests, so you can pull frames out of here to weaken it when you need to, and you can pull frames out of there and put it in here when you need to strengthen it. And you can kind of manage it. You definitely need some kind of way to feed it. Either build a frame feeder like I did, or build a little access to a jar somewhere. But it doesn't even have to be a big jar. It could be just enough room up there for a little 20-ounce pop bottle, with some holes drilled in the cap that it fits down in there. Just something so that you can feed it. And then I put another hole with some number 7 hardware cloth so you can, because pollen doesn't go very well through number 8 hardware cloth, but number 7 hardware cloth it goes through pretty well. If you got some number 7, you can drop some pollen in there now and then. And don't drop the pollen in the syrup. I learned the hard way. It really makes it ferment in a hurry because there's yeast in that pollen. The bees inoculate it when they gather it, even though it hasn't been fermented yet. It's already got yeast in it, so you want it to land somewhere it stays dry. And don't put too much in there in the winter. If you keep putting it in there, sometimes they'll clog up that tube with the pollen because the house bees are just hauling it out for trash. And the nurse bees are looking for it because, yeah, they want some pollen, but the house bees are hauling it out for trash, and they may clog up the exit. So don't feed them too much.
Well, on behalf of the Olympia Beekeepers Association, Michael, we extend our deepest thanks. It was a fascinating and fantastic day to spend with you. And so I think a round of applause. And I'd also like to extend our thanks to all of you. It was great to see so many new faces in the crowd. So glad you came and were able to participate today. Have a safe journey home, wherever that may be, and we'll see you again soon, I hope. Happy beekeeping, and good luck on your observation hives.
I think there's about 3 or 4 books left over there if you guys want to save me having to send them home.
5 books.